Act Out is 100% independent, non-corporatized activist news. And we want to keep acting out, so we need your help. To become a patron of our show, visit patreon.com/actout. This week on Act Out, from predator economics to co-ops, we take a look at how our current system pollutes not only the planet, but marginalized communities through direct and pervasive violence. And while the stock market goes up, our quality of life, both economically and otherwise, continues to fall. There is another way, and economist Richard Wolff joins us to talk about a truly democratic alternative already in practice across the world, even here in the Empire. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. An orange flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. On January 4th of this year, the Dow cracked 24,000 for the first time in history. Yay, right? No. Despite what the Botox, Joker-faced corporate media talking heads told you about this spike, this good news is actually bad for us. As CNN so gleefully put it, the breathtaking pace of the market's rise shows how excited Wall Street is. Corporate profits are gigantic. Companies are sitting on record amounts of cash. Wall Street loves the Republican tax overhaul because it will save companies on what they owe Uncle Sam. In other words, the stock market is directly tied to policies that benefit or hurt Wall Street and the top 1%, not you and me. As Lee Camp noted in an article last week, the stock market does great when workers are effectively exploited. When the average American worker doesn't have the power or leverage to demand better pay or safer working conditions, corporations are thrilled. The stock market grows and the fabled Coke-fueled Wall Street parties go off without a hitch. Furthermore, over 90% of the income gains since the 2008 collapse have gone to the top 1%, and 80% of stock value overhaul is held by the top 10% of the population. Plus, the market does not take into account externalities such as impacts on the environment. Even as the environmental collapses around us, the stock market thrives. So instead of looking at the stock market as an indicator for your economic health, look at it for what it really is. An indicator for the rise in income inequality, the runaway wealth of the top 1% built on the backs of your labor. And don't even bother calling it crony capitalism, it's just capitalism, an extractive predatory system, or to borrow a phrase, predatory economics. Lisa Brunner White Earth Ojibwe used the term to refer to extractive industries such as fracking and pipelines and the various ills that they trigger. Although oil and gas are becoming less and less economically attractive, much of our stock market and therefore much of our political interests rest in the barren wasteland of pipelines, leaking rigs, and explosive natural gas. The aforementioned pus bags at the top are still making bank on fossil fuels, and as long as that's the case, they could really care less how toxic a project is, in all senses of that word. In late December of last year, a judge ruled to push back the timeline for the Enbridge Line 3 crude oil pipeline to at least June 2018. In an article supporting the decision, Ann Manning wrote in the Minnesota Star-Tribune, Minnesotans should be fully aware not only of the environmental risks this so-called good-for-the-economy project entails, but also the human risks. The workers have no connection to the community, get paid large sums of money, and have little to do in their free time. Some will bring trouble, attracting the drug trade, sex trafficking, or both. They'll pollute the land by day, and women and children by night. And much like the regard for the well-being of the planet, authorities have little to no regard for the missing, raped, assaulted, or murdered Indigenous women. For starters, there's no comprehensive data collection system regarding the number of missing or murdered women in Indian country. Yeah, comprehensive data on violence against women under tribal jurisdiction does not exist since no federal or Indian agency nor organization systematically collects that information. Troy Aide, former U.S. Attorney for the state of Colorado, also served on the Indian Law and Order Commission, created under the Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010. He and a fellow commissioner released a report after 2 years of field research that describes law enforcement jurisdiction in Indian country as an indefensible morass of complex, conflicting, and illogical commands, and blames the U.S. government for creating the situation. Federal, local, and tribal enforcement agencies are clusterfucked together, and Eid further reports that these relationships swing from good to almost nothing and even to outright hostility. Back in 2010, hope for progress emerged when the DOJ announced the launch of TAP, or the Tribal Access Program for National Crime Information, in which tribes would be able to report and access crime information in the federal NCIC database. The hope was that reports of missing, abused, or murdered women would not only be dealt with properly, but would be incorporated into a national database. 10 tribes were selected to participate in the pilot program and were to receive NCIC terminals. DOJ officials did not respond to questions about the number of tribes that, as of 2015, had access to those terminals, nor to questions regarding funding for future tribal access. Although the Tulalip tribe is among the 10 participating in the project, in 2015 they had yet to receive a terminal, despite offering to pay for it, according to the tribal attorney Michelle Demert. In another advancement in 2015, 2 years after the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, lawmakers granted tribal courts jurisdiction over a limited number of domestic and dating violence crimes committed by non-Indians on reservations. And while this was indeed absolutely good news for Native women suffering in violent relationships, the law did nothing to address crimes like assault or rape by a stranger, i.e., transient workers. Federal authorities do have the power to step in cases of rape or murder, but they rarely do. In short, Indigenous communities are systematically denied access to tools and resources with which to deal with the continuous colonial violence forced upon them by predominantly extractive industries. We won't help them, and we're not interested in letting them help themselves. Furthermore, when regular people rise up to colonial violence, in particular the so-called man camps, the gavel of our injustice system falls without hesitation in support of the oppressors. In November 2016, dozens of water protectors engaged in an action at a man camp just north of a Dapple Equipment Yard in North Dakota. Man camps is the name given to what Ann Manning mentioned in her article, the temporary housing for mostly out-of-state transient oil field workers, an example which you see here. The action focused not simply on the issue of oil projects, but rather what these projects and man camps bring into Indigenous communities. Erica Gonzalez, a water protector who went to trial last week for participating in the action, said of her involvement, "We wanted to have our ceremony there to raise awareness that wherever these pipelines come in, they bring these man camps, and then our women around the reservations go missing and are getting murdered or raped. The state doesn't do anything about it. I don't want to sugarcoat it. When they're raping our Mother Earth, they are also raping our women." While Gonzalez was acquitted on all charges, her comrades Rebecca Jesse and Roderick Joe were convicted of tampering with a public service, a Class C felony. The conviction was based on the fact that the action caused a 105-minute delay to a coal train bound for Minnesota. Although the train company BNSF suffered no substantial interruption or any financial loss, both Jesse and Joe received a 360 days deferred sentence with court fees and fines not to exceed the bond amount of $1,500 and with credit for 2 days of time already served. In more layman's terms, a deferred sentence is suspended until after a specified period of time, in this case 360 days. If they're not rearrested during that time, the charge can be dismissed and the conviction removed from their records. For their participation in an action calling attention to the rape, murder, assault, and disappearance of an untold number of Indigenous women and girls, these two were made an example of. Meanwhile, the man camps remain, and coal, oil, and gas flow freely from a raped countryside into our water, our atmosphere, and our land in order to bolster Wall Street by any means necessary. Over 300 water protectors are still awaiting trial on state charges in North Dakota, and 6 are preparing for federal criminal trials. Line 3, as I mentioned, is on hold for the time being, with the June 2018 decision expected. The Minnesota Public Utilities Commission will have the final say about Line 3, and we urge these leaders to withdraw their consent from this destructive project and protect all we hold dear, Manning wrote. As has been said, justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. None of us are free until all are free. And moving on, while he certainly doesn't have a spotless record as mayor, last week, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio did more than just withdraw his consent from fossil fuels. He did tap into that outrage by suing 5 of the largest oil companies in the world. With a necessary nod to the work of activists and organizers who, as he put it, have been sounding the alarm for years, de Blasio announced last Wednesday that the city's 5 pension funds, with approximately $5 billion invested in over 190 fossil fuel companies, would be pulling those funds within 5 years. In conjunction with that decision, Mayor de Blasio said, "We're bringing the fight against climate change straight to the fossil fuel companies that knew about its effects and intentionally misled the public to protect their profits. As climate change continues to worsen, it's up to the fossil fuel companies whose greed put us in this position to shoulder the cost of making New York safer and more resilient." And he's right. Hurricane Sandy cost New York City $19 billion in damages, the same amount that the city now needs in order to fund projects to protect it from more disasters wrought by climate change. For a more in-depth look at what the future might hold, not just for New York, but indeed for us all, check out my recent article on climate change realities and how to mitigate them via the link below and in the show description. New York City is the first major U.S. city to make this call, but divestment campaigns and climate liability suits are popping up all over. In conjunction with frontline direct action endeavors, these initiatives are an integral part of the larger fight for people and planet. To get plugged into the divestment movement, visit gofossilfree.org/divestment. And I also highly recommend doing a search for a specific divestment chapter in your area via DuckDuckGo or whatever private search engine you use, because focusing on the local sphere with regards to this issue is absolutely the way to go. You can sway a mayor a lot easier than you can sway a president. Now, moving on from predatory economics, let's talk democratic economics. Chances are that you have a job. Chances are that that job is not structured in a democratic way. Yeah, you got to suggest pizza toppings at your quarterly office party, but I mean really democratic. In the way that co-ops are democratic, where you, the employee, are also the employer, where you actually own your job, you own your company. Unless you're in one of the roughly 330 active co-ops that the United States Federation of Worker Co-ops lists on their site, you're likely spending most of your days in a system of hierarchy that is hugely undemocratic. And why, in the land of the free, that seems rather hypocritical, doesn't it? To get a deeper scoop on this subject, as well as the issues of automation and economic education, we now turn to Professor of Economics and host of the engaging and informative anti-capitalist economics show, Richard Wolff. Take a look.
Capitalism is, in a way, deconstructing itself. It's falling apart. It is proving every day to more people that whoever it benefits, it doesn't benefit the majority of folks. But you're also right, and that's very crucial for us, that there has to be part of any critical movement has to be a plausible plan for something at least to try that could work better. You don't have to provide guarantees. Nobody really can anyway, but a plan and a way forward. Let's try to apply the idea that everybody at a workplace, a factory, an office, a store, is part of a community, the community that makes this workplace successful, that produces a decent output for the consuming public, and that produces a decent experience for all those human beings that come and give themselves each day to this activity. And let's organize it, one person, one vote, to democratize the experience. And I'm convinced, and I'm an economist, so I study this sort of stuff, that this would produce a better outcome for the majority of people than what we have today. It would distribute income much more equally. I mean, no way on earth would a collective of workers, say 200 in some place, decide to give the top executive all the money in the world, and we're not going to use in the factory toxic technology because we all have to breathe that air, and our children do, and our neighbors do. You know, if you think about it, it is a good alternative. Co-ops have been around a long time, all kinds of parts of the American community, farmers, African Americans in the South, others have made real efforts. They're as old as this country is. And here is a way to learn from an earlier experience of collective and community production. So I think it's a way forward.
And with that, I think that's a good segue into what I wanted to talk about regarding automation, because there's a lot of controversy around this. The idea, why not let machines do repetitive or menial tasks so that humans can pursue more creative and stimulating endeavors? The only problem is, of course, that as of right now, the gains from automation go directly up to the 1%. It's not at all split between the workers.
The whole notion of how you handle technology is a spectacularly good for us example of the benefits of a worker co-op. And the way I do it is give a simple example. Suppose you have a new machine that can do, just for simplicity, exactly the work that half your workers used to do, whatever it is, checking out or moving a part from here to there or changing the shape of something. And so now you face the question, well, we used to have 1,000 workers, but with these machines, we don't need 1,000 workers. We only need half as much work because the machine does the other part. For the capitalist, this is wonderful good news, and the capitalist immediately knows what he or she is going to do. They're going to fire half their workers. Why? Because they can get the same output, they can sell it at the same price, bringing in the same revenue they had before, but they have one big fat change. They have half the wage bill they used to have because they fired half the workers. And that half of the wage bill that they used to have to give workers, they get to keep as enhanced profits. Bingo. And they're off to the races with their extra profit. So I like to point out, let's take a slowdown here. Ask the question again. The machines allow you to have half as many workers as before. But that also means you could solve the same problem by saying, bring in the machines and we will all work half as long as we did before. And I think it allows us to make it simple, to use technology for the first time in a democratic way to enhance the quality of life of all the people involved in production. That has never been done before. We've allowed technology to be financed, to be driven, and to be utilized for the sake of a very small minority that own these enterprises, and the rest of us all have to live with the consequences. And let me drive it home one more way. For 500 years, we have justified technological change on the grounds that it liberates us from long hours and hard work and drudgery. Today, I have two children, and both my young adult children work more hours than I did when I was their age. This promised relief from physically exhausting and mentally exhausting labor, this is a false promise. It was made to my children's generation. It's kind of a mockery that technology could have liberated, but under capitalism, as you put it, it went to higher profits, and the promise of less hard work was never delivered.
Taking it one step further, let's say that automation, because this is something that people are also talking about, that automation will just make certain jobs obsolete altogether. So not just half the workforce, the entire workforce is then obsolete. In that situation, what would be your feelings on something like a universal basic income to make up for that and make sure that those profits aren't just going to the top 1%?
Yes, well, I can think of nothing more wonderful than having all drudgery kind of taken care of by machines. I come from a generation where the classic story that we told ourselves about that years ago was when it was discovered, and I know this to be true, that the technology to make a light bulb many years ago was in place basically to make a light bulb that would last like for 70 years. And then we were told the story that GE or Sylvania, whoever the companies were that knew this, systematically squelched all of this because for them, it was dangerous. It would mean you'd buy one light bulb and they wanted you to buy one every year, not once a lifetime. And, you know, we've heard all those stories with the refrigerator and the automobile and everything else, planned obsolescence, they once called it. So, yes, I can see that capitalism has been a barrier to making technology work for the human race. And I would love to see it eliminate or work. And then I would have no problem, if that were doable, to basically finally do something that human beings have dreamed about for millennia, namely disconnect your livelihood from your work activity. The only hesitance I have about a guaranteed basic income is if it becomes divisive in the community. In other words, if we give some people an income with no commitment for them to work, whereas other people are required to work to get an income, we are going to produce bitternesses and envies, justified and unjustified, that I think will blow us up. It'll be an even worse example of how the attempt to make up for capitalism's failures by having a welfare system has produced such enormous tensions over that. So I'm hesitant to do it before it's universal. If it were really universal, if we really do take care of everybody because we can, we physically have enough knowledge and resources to give everyone the basics of food, clothing, shelter, and so on, then I'm all in favor of it. I just don't want to see it as a kind of souped up welfare system because I can see where this divides us in ways that are terribly, terribly ineffective.
With the concept of policy, this idea of unfettered or fettered capitalism has always irked me a little bit because it basically sounds like a fettered capitalism sounds like a chained beast. And then the question becomes, well, why do you have a beast to begin with? So do you think that in terms of policy, do you feel that there is policy that could be enacted to sort of fetter capitalism to the point that we can have a society that's obviously not perfect, but a society that really does work for the 99% and for the particularly marginalized communities that we see today? Or is that just not something that is physically possible with capitalism?
The short answer is I don't think that's possible anymore. And it's history that teaches me that. I don't have an ideological predisposition to that perspective. I look at capitalism as being something pretty much born in the 17th century, roughly in England, and spreading from there to Europe and eventually the whole world. And along the way, it has provoked efforts to make it more humane, to make it less harsh, to make it more collective, to make it more inclusive, all the things we know about. Unfortunately, history teaches that the capitalists, when you do that, immediately go to work to undo it. I mean, the last 50 years of America have been the undoing of what we call the New Deal coalition and the New Deal programs that happened in the 1930s. So at this point, I've said, well, we've tried capitalism. We've tried to reform it. We've tried to prettify it. We've tried to fetter it in various ways, to shape it. It doesn't last.
Finally, I want to talk about this idea of education because that's something that you've done your entire adult life, as you say on your show. Because a lot of the ideas that we're talking about, the downfall of capitalism, co-ops, they really depend on this idea of education, engagement, and outreach. But something that we don't see in higher learning is this idea of co-ops, or even the idea that capitalism is bad. In your professional experience as a teacher, talk about the economic education and how, I mean, even what we've seen, for example, since the Powell memo came out and talked about how we need to have an activist Supreme Court and we need all these liberals out of the school system. Talk about what you've seen in terms of economic education.
The idea of a worker co-op as an alternative to capitalism was absolutely never brought up. It wasn't that it wasn't given much attention. Our professors acted as though that didn't exist, even though they knew, they were smart people. They knew enough history to know that that was out there. I had depending on your point of view, the good fortune or the bad luck to go to fancy American universities. I went to Harvard, then I went to Stanford, and then I went to Yale. I mean, it's like a joke. I'm a poster boy for elite education. They claim to be the best of the world, and blah, blah, blah. But those were the places where the taboo was observed most rigidly. I never was presented with anything like an analysis of a co-op as an alternative way of doing business. Worse than that, I was never presented with a systematic critique of capitalism. It was as if we were to be taught what capitalism is, at the same time that we were taught how absolutely wonderful it is. It's the best thing since sliced bread, and nobody in their right mind would even spend a moment worrying about a better system. It is just so wonderful. But they were so wrapped up in the Cold War and the big struggle with the Soviet Union, and capitalism is good and socialism is bad. And it was so dangerous for their careers to waver even a little bit from that storyline that that's all we got. And, you know, it's pathetic. It's 50 years of lost history in this country when we could have gone much further in our thinking and in our practical work. I was taught to be a cheerleader, and most of my colleagues ended up cheerleading because it was the career path laid out for them. Some of us never found it persuasive, and here we are ending up with a little bit of a "I told you so" to my colleagues, and they grudgingly admit, because they went through the same courses and the same teachers I had, that it really is a sad comment for 50 years that we allowed ourselves to be so bamboozled by the environment that we lost all critical faculties, even as we said to our students that's what we wanted them to develop.
This is but a portion of our extended interview with Richard Wolff, so I strongly encourage you to check that out via our YouTube page at the link below and via our social media sites. And with that, we'll wrap this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. I will be performing live spoken word and projected visuals this Friday the 19th in Pittsburgh at the Big Idea Bookstore and February 9th at Bone Shaker Books in Minneapolis. For more information on that, visit artkillingapathy.com. Also, you can find the other sites mentioned in this week's show in the upcoming slide, and for interim updates as well as posted videos, visit us on social media. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and served my shove. I'm not a violent man.